Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Investment Trends, where we discuss the latest news in the stock market and the economy. So once again, I'm joined by John McKay, and we're thrilled to share with you some of the things that we've been reading and watching this week as it relates to the overall economy and the stock market. So first up, what we saw on Wednesday was some unfortunate news as the CPI inflation reading came out. And unfortunately, it was up to 4.2%, which is actually the highest inflation number we have seen since April of 2023. What did you see with that most recent inflation reading?
Yeah, with CPI up about 40 bips or just under 0.5%. Up from April, it hits people both in their pocketbook, but also with their investment accounts, because higher inflation, while it can sometimes be good, that will likely lead to a Fed rate hike at some point this year.
Yep.
And with that,
definitely something that can make investors a little bit uneasy. Obviously, rising inflation has a negative impact on bond prices as well. So something to keep an eye on. But it feels like this reading that came out was a little bit overdue or even anticipated by some, just from what we've seen with what's going on, continuing to go on with Iran.
Yeah, and energy really is the story here. Gasoline is up 40% year over year. And we're seeing fuel oil up just under 60% year over year.
Wow.
And that's all attributable to the supply shock that we're seeing from the strait being closed.
Yes. Yeah. And unfortunately, it still seems like, no end in sight, as just as recent as this past Tuesday. Continuing strikes, Iran shooting down one of the U.S. helicopters and the U.S. retaliating for that. So, I know President Trump continues to try to get some type of deal worked out, but it just seems like there's no clear end in sight with this. Unfortunately, that seems like it's going to continue to lead to higher gas prices at the pump for people, which is like you said, obviously can take away some of that discretionary spending that we see or that the economy needs really to keep things going higher. With that in mind, an area to look at once again for investors would probably be the energy sector. Obviously looking at what those prices might be, or some of these companies as they stay a little bit higher or they do become constrained. It could be an area for some allocation to your portfolio. But next week we'll have the first meeting for Kevin Warsh as he takes over as the Fed chair. What are you kind of anticipating that we'll see or that we'll hear from him?
Yeah, as we have touched on in recent weeks, I think the market was really expecting him to be a pretty friendly Fed chair.
Yep.
And whether it's keeping rates where they are or cutting further, the handy's been dealt. I don't see how that's going to be the case. All of the macro data points that go into these decisions, it's looking like maybe not this meeting, but at some point this year, I would be prepared to see a rate hike coming our way.
Yeah, and that would could potentially send some shockwaves through the market. I know you mentioned it before, but typically when we see rate hikes, small cap companies tend to get hit a little bit harder. Companies that borrow or have a lot of debt on their balance sheets to help fuel growth tend to be negatively impacted the most during a rising rate environment. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on if that does hold true. I know that it felt like the promise of a new Fed chair was for them to be more aggressive with cutting rates. I think the one thing that could be good is some of the jobs reports that have come out recently.
Yeah, we saw in May non-farm payrolls up 172,000, which was more than double estimate. Which again, that's great. But looking at kind of the Fed's charter and what they try to do, they're looking at that roughly 4% unemployment, or as they call it, full employment. So again, they might try to kind of take some of the wind out of the sails there. Try to slow things down and avoid bubble-like environments.
The next topic here, we actually touched on this last week, but obviously it's too big to ignore. Today will be the official IPO of SpaceX, which is the largest IPO in the history of the stock market. It has been announced that they're expecting the shares to trade at $135 per share, which is different from other IPOs where they tend to give more of a range. Them coming out and saying $135 a share basically means some huge numbers for SpaceX of capital that will be flowing into that company, and obviously into Elon Musk's personal wealth as well.
Yeah, and I really want to just stress people should be doing their research if they're looking to get into this. And with a lot of what SpaceX is looking to do, there's still a lot of development that needs to happen, both physical and theoretical. And I think that if you want to get exposure to SpaceX, you should be looking at this as a pretty long-term play.
Right.
There's a lot of upside, but we're probably not going to see that tomorrow, next week, or in the next year. This is kind of a long-term vision company, and Elon retaining 80% of voting rights allows them to do that.
Yes. Yeah, so I know you mentioned before, how would you break down some of the key business segments for SpaceX?
Yeah, their connectivity business, which is Starlink, that's kind of the cash machine that's delivering relatively low price internet around the world via satellite. Those are in low Earth orbit, so they get those up there using the space vertical that they have. With the space vertical, the real game changer would be this Starship project. They've already cut the cost of putting any object into orbit significantly. This would cut it by about, I think it's at about $2,500 per kilogram right now. Elon's long-term goal with Project Starship would have it at about $10 per kilogram, which is an astronomical cut. So that is really what a lot of their long-term goals hinges upon, them being able to reduce that cost to a point where it makes sense to do some of these kind of crazy things like orbital data centers, putting those in low Earth orbit, having them powered fully by solar 24/7, 365. That is kind of, at least as I see it, what needs to happen for XAI, the artificial intelligence wing, to kind of get an advantage over the rest of the market.
So with the valuation that we're seeing at IPO price, that is roughly about 94 times their price to revenue is where it's being priced on opening day, so to speak, on the IPO day. So you really need to ask yourself, what does that look like? Like you mentioned, John, I wouldn't look at this as a kind of a short-term investment. Definitely something that is, what could that revenue be in the next 5 to 10 years? How could people go about if they're interested in this? Obviously, this isn't a recommendation, but if anyone wanted to invest in it, what should they be looking at? Do they announce the ticker symbols, and where can you kind of go about buying into SpaceX?
Yeah, the ticker symbol is going to be SPCX. First off, as we talked about last week, there's going to be some level of expedited entry into certain indices. The S&P actually noted that they will not make an exception, but it's fully expected to be in the NASDAQ 100 in the next month. So if you have exposure to any NASDAQ 100 linked ETF, you're likely going to have exposure one way or another. With that also, if you're really set on having SpaceX in your portfolio and you've done your research, this afternoon, it's kind of opaque what time trading will begin, but you'll likely need to put in a limit order. So you'll set kind of your top dollar limit per share that you want to put in, and number of shares that you're looking to have filled. There's no guarantee you'll have any or your whole order filled, just due to demand trends and what's available using your platform. But that would kind of be the game plan.
Yeah, and that's a hard. It's a hard thing to do, right? To price it, to set that limit order. Hopefully, it fills. Sometimes it might blow right past that number. If you have something set above that $135 per share number, there's no guarantee that those shares actually get filled and that you would own SpaceX stock. So, definitely something to keep an eye on. And like you mentioned, John, some of those key dates would be when it gets added into the NASDAQ 100. That would mean that a lot of people that have money in 401ks and index funds would then have exposure to SpaceX. Another key date to keep in the back of your mind would be 3 months after the IPO date is when some of the insiders could sell their shares. At SpaceX, the vast majority of their employees have stock. That was one of the ways that Elon would compensate people. So could be some selling 3 months later as they're allowed to, as some of those insiders are allowed to. So even if you do miss out today, does not mean that you can't eventually get into the stock at some point.
Yeah, I believe this week we saw for the first time solar overtake coal on the U.S. energy production scale, which it's interesting because solar, you're limited by the time that the sun is up, the conditions with weather and everything. Is interesting thinking about AI, just the amount of energy that's required for these data centers to run and to train models and then to put them into production. You look at China and they're pumping out new coal power plants, new nuclear plants, like it's going out of style. And, we need some sort of further development either on that solar storage or new technology if we're going to keep up just on energy production with China.
Yeah, that'll be something that's interesting to watch, with the rollout of data centers and how much blowback they're now receiving from communities there that, these large companies want to open up data centers at. So definitely something to keep an eye on over the next, 1 to 3 to 5 years, what really comes about, because they term it as kind of the picks and shovels that are required for the AI build out and what that's going to do to our infrastructure overall. That's what we've got for this week, what we've been watching, what we've been discussing. Obviously, a lot of this information is for educational purposes only. So if you're interested in learning more about anything we discussed, feel free to reach out. If there are any certain stocks or sectors you're following, please leave a comment below. We'd be happy to talk with you.